My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and 3 days before my flight to see my dying grandmother, my own father canceled my ticket without telling me. I found out by accident. I was standing in the break room at Northwestern Memorial, still in my scrubs, checking my email between two 12-hour shifts when I saw a message from the airline. Your itinerary has been changed. I hadn't changed anything. I hadn't touched that booking since the day I made it, 6 weeks earlier, the day my grandmother's doctor told us she had maybe 2 months left. I opened the email with my thumb shaking slightly, more out of confusion than fear. My flight from Chicago to Columbus, the one I'd booked for Friday morning so I could be there for what my father called a family meeting at Grandma Leaner's house, that flight was gone. Canceled. Refunded to a card that wasn't even mine. That's when the second shock hit, the one that turned confusion into something colder. The refund had gone to a Visa ending in 4471. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the name attached to it in the transaction log my banking app pulled up when I searched the last 4 digits out of pure reflex. Richard Carter, my father. He had used his own card to buy my ticket as a surprise back in June, a rare gesture from a man who wasn't big on gestures, and now, without a word to me, he'd canceled it and pocketed the refund. I want to ask you something before I go further because I think about this every time I tell this story. If you were in a break room, phone in hand, staring at an email that made no sense in your own city at your own job, where are you watching this from right now? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Because in that moment, sitting on a plastic chair that smelled like burnt coffee, I didn't know I was about to walk into the middle of something my father, my stepmother, and my half-sister had been planning for months. I didn't know that family meeting was code for something else entirely. All I knew was that my father had quietly erased my seat on a plane to see a woman who might not live to see Christmas, and he hadn't said a single word to me about it. So I did the only thing that made sense. I opened a new tab and I booked another flight, same day, different airline, more expensive, paid for with my own card. I wasn't going to ask his permission twice. I called him that night anyway because some stubborn part of me still wanted an explanation that made him look less guilty than the evidence did. Dad, my flight got canceled. Did you do that? There was a pause just half a second too long. Oh yeah, sorry, sweetheart, I meant to call you. Things changed on this end. The meeting got pushed. No point flying out yet. Pushed to when? We'll figure out a new date, I'll let you know. It was smooth. Too smooth, the way a lie sounds when someone's rehearsed it in the shower that morning. My father was a retired insurance adjuster. 30 years of reading people who were trying to get one over on a claim. He knew how to sound calm. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last 8 years as an ICU nurse learning to read the difference between calm and controlled. Dad, Grandma has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. There is no "we'll figure out a new date." There's a clock. Emily, don't be dramatic. I've got it handled. That phrase, "I've got it handled," is the one that stuck with me for days afterward, because it was the exact same thing he'd said 4 years earlier, right before he sold Grandma's late husband's old fishing cabin out from under her without asking, using a power of attorney she didn't remember signing. She'd forgiven him for that one, mostly because she didn't want a war in the family during what she assumed were her last good years. I hadn't forgotten it. I just filed it away. I told him I'd booked another flight myself. Another pause, longer this time. You didn't need to do that. Apparently I did. He didn't argue, he just said, fine, do what you want, and hung up first, which was new. My father never hung up first. He liked to be the one who ended things. That night I texted my half-sister, Vanessa, same father, different mother, 6 years younger than me, and someone I'd always kept at a careful, polite distance. I asked her if she knew anything about a family meeting at Grandma's. She left me on read for 11 hours. When she finally answered, all she wrote was, "Ask Dad," 3 words. From a sister who normally sent me paragraphs about her yoga studio's new class schedule. Something was very clearly happening in Columbus, and every single person involved wanted me nowhere near it. I couldn't sleep that night, so I did what I always do when I can't sleep. I organized something. This time it was my inbox. I went digging through old family emails, the kind you keep because deleting them feels wrong even when you never reread them. I was looking for anything related to Grandma's estate, and that's when I found a thread from 14 months earlier that I'd apparently skimmed and forgotten. It was between my father and a man named Gerald Whitfield, subject line. Notary services, a leaner C. I hadn't thought anything of it back then. Grandma was 79, healthy-ish, and notaries handle boring paperwork all the time, insurance beneficiary updates, property deeds, nothing sinister on its face. But now, with fresh eyes and a much darker mood, I reread every message in that thread. Gerald Whitfield wasn't just any notary. He was a longtime friend of my father's from his old adjusting firm, someone I remembered vaguely from a barbecue a decade ago. And in one email, dated just 3 weeks after Grandma's cancer diagnosis, my father had written, "Let's get this finalized before things get complicated. G will come to the house, doesn't need to be a big production. Get this finalized. Before things get complicated." I sat with that sentence for a long time. In my line of work, I've watched enough families fall apart around hospital beds to know exactly what getting things finalized usually means when it happens in a hurry, right after a bad diagnosis, using a friend instead of an independent court-appointed notary. It means someone's rewriting a will. I want to be honest with you, at that point, I still had a small, hopeful part of me that wanted this to be nothing. Maybe it was about her medical directive. Maybe it was innocent. Grief and suspicion make you see conspiracies in grocery lists sometimes, and I know that. But the timing of my flight getting silently canceled 3 days before this family meeting was not a coincidence I could talk myself out of. I booked a hotel near Grandma's house instead of staying with my father like we'd originally planned. If I was walking into something, I wanted my own base of operations. I packed my bag, I set my alarm for 4:40 a.m., and I didn't tell a single member of my family that I was still coming. The flight was rough, turbulence over Indiana that had the woman next to me gripping her armrest so hard her knuckles went white, but I barely noticed it. I spent the whole 2 hours staring at the seat back in front of me, running through everything I knew, which honestly wasn't much. A canceled flight, a cagey phone call, a 14-month-old email about a notary, a sister who told me to ask Dad instead of just answering me. It wasn't proof of anything. It was a feeling, and feelings don't hold up in court, something I reminded myself of the entire descent into John Glenn International. I rented a car instead of calling my father for a ride, which would have announced my arrival before I was ready to make it. I drove straight to Grandma Leaner's house on Larkspur Lane, the same brick two-story she'd lived in for 41 years, the one with the wraparound porch where she used to shell peas every summer while I sat on the steps below her, half listening to stories about my grandfather. There were 3 cars in the driveway that shouldn't have been there yet if the meeting was supposed to happen Friday. My father's gray Buick, my stepmother Diane's SUV, and a car I didn't recognize, a silver sedan with a dealer plate frame from a place called Whitfield Notary and Signing Services. My stomach dropped in a way it hadn't since my first codes as a new nurse. It was Wednesday, 2 days early. I didn't get out of the car right away. I sat in the driveway of the house I grew up visiting every summer, watching through the front window as 4 shapes moved around the dining room table. My father, my stepmother, a man I assumed was Gerald Whitfield, and my grandmother, sitting at the head of the table where she'd hosted every Thanksgiving of my childhood, now bent slightly over a stack of papers with a pen in her thin, shaking hand. They hadn't waited for the meeting. They'd moved it up, and they'd done it the exact moment they thought I'd be safely thousands of miles away, unaware, boarding a flight that no longer existed. I got out of the car. I didn't knock. I still had a key from years ago, the one Grandma insisted I keep in case of emergencies, and this felt close enough to one. The look on my father's face when I walked into that dining room is something I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't guilt, not at first. It was pure, naked shock, the expression of a man watching a plan collapse in real time. "Emily," he said, standing up too fast, his chair scraping the hardwood. "What are you? I thought your flight." "You canceled my flight," I said, "so I bought another one." Diane's face went a shade paler. Gerald Whitfield, a heavyset man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, quietly slid a folder half an inch across the table as if that would make it invisible. Grandma Alina looked up at me, and for a second, just a second, I saw something in her eyes I can only describe as relief. Then it was gone, replaced by the confused, foggy expression that had become more common since she'd started her second round of chemo. "Sweetheart," she said, "you're early, or am I early? What day is it?" That question broke something in me. My grandmother, one of the sharpest women I'd ever known, a retired high school principal who used to do the New York Times crossword in pen, couldn't tell me what day it was. And my father was sitting her down at a table with a notary to sign legal documents in that state. "What is this?" I asked, looking at the folder Gerald had tried to hide. "What are you having her sign?" "It's nothing you need to worry about," my father said, his voice sliding into the tone he used to use when I was 16 and asking too many questions. "Just some paperwork." "Updating her file?" "What kind of paperwork requires a notary to drive out here 2 days before you told me the meeting was happening?" Diane spoke up then, sharper than I expected. "Emily, this really isn't the time. Your grandmother is tired." "She's tired," I repeated. "So this is a good time to have her sign something she just told me she's confused about the date for?" Nobody answered that. Gerald Whitfield started quietly gathering the papers, the universal signal of a man who wanted to leave a room that was about to get worse. "Don't," I said, and I put my hand flat on the folder before he could close it. "I want to see what she's signing." My father tried to physically move between me and the table, which tells you something about where his instincts went in that moment. Not toward honesty, toward damage control. "Emily, this is not appropriate," he said. "This is a private family matter." "She's my grandmother too," I said, "and I'm not leaving this room until someone tells me what's in that folder." Grandma Alina, to her enormous credit, put her frail hand over mine on the table and said, in a voice that suddenly sounded much more like the woman I remembered, "Let her see it, Richard." He hesitated. Then, because arguing with his own dying mother in front of a witness was apparently a line even he wasn't ready to cross, he stepped back. I opened the folder. The first page was a last will and testament, dated that same week, replacing one that had been drawn up 9 years earlier by Grandma's longtime attorney, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who I remembered from childhood as a family friend who used to bring us peppermint candy. This new document had been drafted by a firm I'd never heard of. One page listed the drafting attorney's name as someone named Bruce Feldstein. No address I recognized, just a P.O. box in a different county entirely. The bequests in the new will were completely different from what Grandma had told me more than once over the years in casual conversation about when I'm gone. The lake house, which she'd always said would be split evenly between me, Vanessa, and our cousin Marcus, was now left entirely to my father. Her savings account, a modest but meaningful sum she'd built up over decades of careful budgeting after my grandfather passed, was now structured to pass through a trust with my father as sole trustee, with discretionary distributions to be made to grandchildren as deemed appropriate. Discretionary. As deemed appropriate, by him. I felt something go very still and very cold inside me, the way it does in a code when the monitor flatlines and your training takes over before your emotions do. "You're cutting Vanessa and Marcus out completely," I said, not even looking up. "And putting yourself in charge of whatever's left for me." "That's not what's happening," my father said. "Then explain what's happening. Because that's exactly what this page says." He didn't answer. Gerald Whitfield, to his credit, looked distinctly uncomfortable, glancing between my father and the door like a man reconsidering every decision that had led him to that dining room. I flipped to the next page, expecting more of the same, and instead found something that made the ground feel even less stable under me. It was a durable power of attorney, financial and medical, naming my father as sole agent, with a clause revoking any prior powers of attorney, including one that I would later learn had named me as a backup agent, drawn up years earlier when Grandma was still fully in control of her faculties and had wanted, in her words, someone practical and level-headed, as a second option in case something happened to her son. That clause had just been erased with a signature that wasn't dry yet. "This gives you complete control," I said. "Medical decisions, finances, everything, and it takes away the backup that already existed." "It's standard for someone her age with her diagnosis," my father said. "You'd understand that if you weren't so quick to assume the worst about me. I'd understand it a lot better if you hadn't canceled my flight to keep me away while it happened." That landed. I watched it land, a small flinch around his eyes that he tried to cover by adjusting his glasses. "I want you to ask him something, by the way," Grandma said suddenly, looking at me, her voice steadier than it had been all evening, like the shock of the confrontation had briefly cut through the fog. "Ask him about the account at Fifth Third, the one he opened in my name last spring." The room went silent in a completely different way. "Mom," my father said, "we talked about this. You get confused about accounts sometimes. I am not confused about a bank teller calling me to ask why my son wanted to add himself as a joint owner on an account I didn't remember opening, Grandma said, each word deliberate, clear, absolutely lucid. I remember that phone call perfectly, Richard. I looked at my father. For the first time since I'd walked in, he didn't have a smooth answer ready. I want to see that account, I said quietly. Tonight, if you have online banking pulled up anywhere in this house. Absolutely not, Diane snapped, finding her voice again. You don't get to barge in here and start auditing this family's finances like you're in charge. Nobody's in charge, I said. That's the whole problem. Somebody decided he was, and he did it while making sure I wasn't in the room. Gerald Whitfield made his exit about 10 minutes later, mumbling something about needing to let the family sort this out, and that he'd hold off on filing anything until everyone was on the same page. My father looked like he wanted to physically block the door to keep him from leaving, but even he understood that a notary walking out mid-signing with no documents completed was not a good look for whatever paper trail he was trying to build. I want to pause here and ask you something because it's the kind of question that matters more than people think. Have you ever been in a room where you could feel the exact moment a lie stopped working? Where the person telling it knew you'd caught them and they just stopped trying as hard? That was the moment for me. Comment if you felt that before. I think almost everyone has at least once. I didn't get the bank account pulled up that night. My father claimed the Wi-Fi was down, which was almost funny given that Diane's phone buzzed with a notification not 2 minutes later. I didn't push it. I'd learned enough in one evening to know that pushing too hard, too fast, in a house where 3 adults were united against me, wasn't going to get me anywhere except locked out entirely. Instead, I did something my father didn't expect. I stayed calm. I told him I understood everyone was stressed, that Grandma's diagnosis had scared all of us, and that maybe we should all sleep on it and talk again tomorrow with clearer heads. He visibly relaxed. That relaxation told me everything. He thought he'd weathered the storm, that I was folding the way I usually did, the peacekeeper daughter who avoided conflict. I hugged my grandmother goodnight longer than usual and I whispered in her ear, "Don't sign anything else until I talk to you privately." She squeezed my hand. "I wasn't planning to, sweetheart." I drove back to my hotel that night and instead of sleeping, I sat at the little desk by the window and made a list. Every document I'd seen, every date, every name, Gerald Whitfield. Bruce Feldstein, Fifth Third Bank, the P.O. Box address, the language about discretionary distributions. Then I did something I probably should have done from the very first email about that notary 14 months earlier. I called Patricia Alvarez, Grandma's original attorney, the one who'd drafted the will 9 years ago, the one my father had quietly cut out of the process entirely. Patricia remembered me immediately, which surprised me a little given how many clients a family law attorney sees over the years. "Emily Carter, Eleanor's granddaughter," the nurse. "She talks about you constantly." I told her everything, the canceled flight, the new will, the power of attorney, the joint bank account Grandma didn't remember opening. There was a long pause on the line when I finished. "Emily, I need to tell you something and I need you to stay calm while I do," Patricia said. "Your grandmother called my office about 4 months ago. She wanted to update her will, not the way your father is describing it, but a smaller change, adding a provision for a scholarship fund at her old high school. We had one phone consultation, and then I never heard from her again. Every follow-up email I sent bounced back or went unanswered. I assumed she'd changed her mind." "Why would her emails bounce?" "That's what I'd like to know too," Patricia said. "Emily, do you know if anyone else has access to her email account?" I thought about it, and the answer arrived with an unpleasant, sinking clarity. My father had set Grandma up with a new laptop the previous year after her old one crashed. He'd been the one to configure everything, the email, the passwords, all of it, because Grandma had never been particularly comfortable with technology. "My father set up her computer," I said slowly. "He'd have had access to everything from the start." "That would explain a great deal," Patricia said, her tone carefully professional but unmistakably grim underneath it. "Emily, I want to be direct with you. What you're describing, a new will drafted by an unfamiliar attorney, executed in a rush after a terminal diagnosis, alongside a new power of attorney and a joint bank account the principal doesn't recall authorizing, That pattern has a name in my field. It's a serious one. I think you need to talk to an elder law attorney and possibly adult protective services sooner rather than later. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after she said that, watching the lights of a gas station across the street blink through the hotel curtains. I need you to help me, I finally said. Because I think my father has been planning this for over a year, and I think he's running out of time to finish it before she dies. The next morning, before I went back to the house, I called Fifth Third Bank's fraud line and asked what my rights were as a family member with concerns about a possible elder financial exploitation situation. The representative I spoke with, a patient man named Darnell, walked me through the process. I couldn't get account details without authorization, but I could file a formal concern that would trigger an internal review, and I could encourage my grandmother as the account holder to request her own statements directly. So that's what I did. I drove to Larkspur Lane with a printed list of questions, and more importantly, with Grandma's reading glasses that I'd noticed she'd left at the restaurant we'd gone to 2 Christmases ago, and that I'd been meaning to mail back for embarrassingly long. It gave me a reason to ask for a few minutes alone with her, away from my father and Diane, under the guise of a small, sentimental errand. We sat on the back porch, just the two of us, the way we used to when I was a kid. I asked her gently to tell me everything she remembered about the Fifth Third account. She remembered more than my father probably hoped. A call from the bank the previous spring, flagging unusual activity, a joint owner added to her account without a branch visit, processed instead through an online form. She remembered being confused, calling my father to ask about it, and him telling her it was just a formality in case something happens to you so bills don't get frozen. She'd trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He was her son. She also remembered, and this detail made my hands go cold around my coffee cup, a day about 6 weeks earlier when my father had brought a stack of papers to the house for her to sign for the new financial advisor, and had stayed in the room the entire time, occasionally pointing at lines and saying, "Just initial there, Mom, don't worry about the legal wording, it's standard." She'd signed without reading closely because she trusted him, because she was tired from chemo, because signing things her son put in front of her had never once in 79 years felt like something that required suspicion. That stack of papers, I would later confirm through Patricia's help and a formal records request, included the authorization that had let Bruce Feldstein's firm draft the new will in the first place, along with an early, unsigned draft of the same power of attorney I'd seen at the table 2 nights before. He hadn't started this the week of the canceled flight. He'd started it months earlier, quietly, one signature at a time, always phrased as something small and routine. I went into the house and found my father alone in the kitchen, and this time I didn't dance around it. "I talked to Patricia Alvarez," I said. "I talked to the bank. I know about the papers you had her sign 6 weeks ago. I know you told her not to worry about the legal wording." His face did something I'd never seen it do before. It just emptied out, the practiced calm draining away because he finally understood there was no smooth answer left that would work. "You don't understand what it's like," he said, his voice suddenly much smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Do you have any idea what her care is going to cost? What happens after she's gone, dealing with the house, the taxes, splitting things 3 or 4 ways among people who barely visit her? I'm the one who drives out here every week. I'm the one managing her medications, her doctor's appointments. Vanessa calls twice a month. Marcus hasn't visited in 2 years. Why should everyone get an equal share of something I'm the one holding together?" There was a real grievance buried somewhere in that outburst, and I want to be honest about that, because pretending my father was a cartoon villain with no human motive underneath the betrayal wouldn't be truthful. He resented feeling like the only one carrying weight. He was scared about money, about what would happen to his own retirement if Grandma's care ate through her savings before she died. Fear and resentment are real things. They just don't give you the right to forge your mother's understanding of what she's signing. "That doesn't give you the right to lie to her," I said, "to have her sign things without reading them, to cancel my flight so I wouldn't be here to ask questions. If you'd come to me, to Vanessa, to Marcus, and said, 'I need more support, I need this handled fairly,' we would have listened. Instead, you tried to make it disappear behind her back while she still had a pulse." "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but there was no force behind it anymore. It was the sound of a man who knew the conversation had already been lost, somewhere back on that dining room floor 2 nights earlier, and was only now catching up to that fact. I know enough to call an elder law attorney this afternoon, I said. And I know enough that this isn't over just because Gerald Whitfield left without a signature. I wish I could tell you that everything resolved cleanly within a week, the way it might in a movie, but real life doesn't move that fast, and I think it's important to be honest about that part too. It took nearly 3 months. I hired an elder law attorney named Sandra Kim, who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, and together we filed a formal report with Ohio's Adult Protective Services, along with a petition to review the validity of the new will and power of attorney before Grandma's condition made any future testimony impossible. There were setbacks. My father hired his own attorney and initially fought the APS investigation, claiming I was a disgruntled family member overreacting to normal estate planning. For about 6 agonizing weeks, it genuinely looked like it might come down to a he said, she said standoff, with Grandma's fluctuating clarity making her own testimony an unreliable weapon for either side. Diane stopped speaking to me entirely. Vanessa, to my surprise, eventually came around. She'd apparently had her own uneasy feelings about the rushed will but had been too afraid of our father's temper to say anything, until I gave her an opening to say it to an investigator instead of to me directly. The turning point came when the bank's internal review confirmed what Grandma had described. The joint account had been added through an online form using a device IP address that matched my father's home Wi-Fi network. At a time when Grandma herself had been at a doctor's appointment 40 minutes away, an appointment I was able to confirm through her medical records with her consent. He hadn't just influenced her signature, he'd acted while she wasn't even in the house. That single piece of evidence, more than anything I'd said in that dining room, was what finally made his attorney advise him to settle rather than fight. By late autumn, the new will and power of attorney were formally voided by the court, reverting to the original documents Patricia Alvarez had drafted 9 years earlier. My father agreed, as part of the settlement, to step down as any kind of financial agent and to reimburse the joint account back to Grandma's sole ownership. He wasn't criminally charged. Sandra had explained early on that elder financial exploitation cases involving family members rarely result in prosecution unless the amounts are large or the family pushes for it. And Grandma, even furious, didn't want to see her own son in a courtroom in handcuffs. She wanted, more than anything, to spend whatever time she had left without that particular war hanging over her. Grandma Aliner passed away the following spring, 7 months after that dining room confrontation. Quietly in her own bed, with hospice care, and at her specific request, all 3 of her grandchildren in the house, me, Vanessa, and Marcus, who'd flown in from Seattle the moment he understood what had almost happened. My father was there too, at the end. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. Whatever he tried to do, whatever fear and resentment had curdled into something ugly enough to forge his own mother's understanding of a legal document, he still loved her in his flawed and complicated way. He held her hand in those final hours. He cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry. I didn't forgive him that day, and I'm not sure I fully have even now, but I also didn't feel the need to make his grief smaller than mine. The estate was distributed according to the original will. The lake house split 3 ways between me, Vanessa, and Marcus. The savings account passed directly, without any trust or discretionary distributions. Split according to what Grandma had actually, clearly, repeatedly wanted before anyone tried to rewrite her intentions for her. My relationship with my father has never gone back to what it was. We speak occasionally, mostly around holidays, mostly short and careful. There's a formality between us now that wasn't there before, a distance that I think is the honest, permanent cost of what he did, and I've made a kind of peace with that distance rather than pretending it isn't there. Vanessa and I, on the other hand, grew closer than we'd ever been. Fear had kept her silent for a long time, and once that fear had somewhere safe to go, she turned out to be someone I actually wanted in my life, not just someone I was related to by circumstance. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story, what made me suspicious enough that night in the break room to book a second flight instead of just believing my father's excuse and letting it go. Honestly, I think it was smaller than any single clue. It was the pause before he answered. The refund going to a card I didn't recognize. The phrase, "I've got it handled," which I'd heard once before, right before he did something he shouldn't have. I don't think there's a triumphant way to end a story like this, and I don't think I want one. Nobody won, not really. A family broke a little in ways that mostly healed and a little in ways that probably never will. My grandmother spent some of her last good months dealing with lawyers and investigators instead of just resting, and that's a cost none of the paperwork in the world can undo, even once it was corrected. But she also got to spend those months knowing the truth, knowing her wishes would actually be honored, knowing that at least one person in her family had cared enough to get on a second flight instead of quietly staying home the way she was meant to. If there's a takeaway here, I think it's this. The people who love you honestly don't need to keep you away from the truth to get what they want from you. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for the people you love is simply refuse to stay where someone else decided to put you. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. If it made you think of your own family, I hope it reminded you to ask the questions nobody wants asked before it's too late to ask them.